Somewhere in the strait off Hakata Bay, there is a shape in the water that should not exist for another 735 years. 610 feet of angular steel, its hull sloping inward, a geometry that would baffle every shipwright alive in 1281. It makes almost no sound, and it leaves almost no trace. 15,000 tons of warship, cutting through a medieval ocean at over 30 knots. The only evidence it passed is the wake already dissolving. Like a secret, the sea decided to keep. This is the USS Zumwalt, a guided missile destroyer commissioned in 2016, built around the idea that the most dangerous warship is the one nobody knows. Its hull was engineered to scatter radar waves into nothing, returning a signature no bigger than a fishing boat. But there is no radar here. The water around it is choked with timber. 4,400 vessels stretch to the horizon. War junks and troop transports and supply barges. Their masts packed so tight, they look like a forest that drowned standing up. 140,000 soldiers sit aboard, assembled on the orders of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, ruler of everything from the Caspian Sea to the Korean coastline. This is his second attempt at Japan. The first ended in humiliation. 78 megawatts of electrical power cycle through the Zumwalt's integrated propulsion, enough to light a small city, generated by gas turbines. Turbines that will not be invented for centuries. To a Mongol oarsman pulling his shift in the belly of a troop transport, the thing gliding past in the dark would not register as a ship. It would register as a feeling, a wrongness in the current. Consider what it actually costs to put 4,400 ships on the water, not in gold, though the gold was staggering, in human lives bent to a single man's refusal to hear the word no. Somewhere in the shipyards of Goryeo, Korea, men who never wanted to build warships are working through their second winter, hands split from cold and salt timber, constructing vessels for an emperor who isn't even their emperor. They're building because Kublai Khan conquered their king, and conquered kings do what they're told. Every plank nailed into those hulls represents a debt paid in forced labor, to an appetite that still found itself unsatisfied by the view. 7 years earlier, the first invasion had failed. 30,000 troops landed near Hakata Bay, fought the samurai to a bloody standstill, and pulled back when a storm tore the fleet apart. Any reasonable ruler reassesses after something like that. But Kublai Khan is not reasonable. He is the grandson of Genghis Khan, heir to a family enterprise, built entirely on the principle that every piece of land visible from the saddle belongs to you, and every piece beyond that belongs to you too. You just haven't ridden there yet. Japan said no, and in the Mongol framework, that was not an available answer. So he spent those 7 years doing what the Mongol machine does best. He squeezed the shipyards of southern China, freshly conquered Song dynasty territory, where the sawdust hadn't settled from the last war. He conscripted Korean laborers by the tens of thousands. Many of the soldiers were not Mongol at all, but Chinese and Korean men fighting under a banner they never chose, for an island they had no quarrel with, because one man on a throne in Khanbalik wanted to add one more coastline to a map that already covered half the known world. This is what greed looks like when it has the resources of an empire. Not a man hoarding coins in a cellar, a man who owns everything from Beijing to Baghdad and cannot stomach a single archipelago existing outside his ledger. The fleet, gathering off that coast in 1281, is not a military operation in any ordinary sense. It is an ego with sails, and gliding silently through the dark water ahead of it is something that particular ego has absolutely no framework for. But here is the question worth sitting with, and drop your honest answer below. If you held that much power, commanded that many ships, had that many men ready to die on your word alone, would you really have done anything different? 3 flagships are burning, and nobody is given an order in 4 minutes. That is how fast a command structure dies. When it was never designed to survive something it couldn't see coming. Picture a junior officer standing on the deck of a troop transport somewhere. He has spent the last 6 weeks following signal flags, relayed from the Eastern Route flagship. Every course correction, every formation shift, every decision about when to eat and when to row came down through that single visual chain. Now the ship those signals came from is a column of fire, reflecting off flat water, and the officer is holding a lantern. With no one to signal, and no one signaling him. He is not injured. His ship is untouched. But he is operationally dead, because the system that told him what to do next just stopped existing. This is the part most people miss when they imagine a fleet being attacked. The explosions are dramatic, sure, a 1,000-pound warhead folding a 140,000-pound vessel inward. Like wet paper, it makes for a spectacular image. But the real damage is quieter and far more total. Every one of those command ships was a node in a network with no backup. Mongol military doctrine was built for the steppe, where a general sat on a horse and could see his entire army. Transplant that logic onto open ocean, spread across 4,400 hulls stretching to the horizon. And what you actually have is a system held together by line of sight. Sever 2 or 3 of those lines, and the entire web goes slack. The Zumwalt doesn't need to sink every ship, or even most of them. It just needs to remove the right ones. And here is the quietly devastating detail. The weapon doing this work is navigating on technology, so self-contained. It doesn't require a single piece of infrastructure that exists in 1281. No satellite, no ground beacon, nothing but a gyroscope spinning in a sealed housing, counting degrees of rotation, running calculations that won't be formally described for another 6 centuries. The missile carries its own world with it. The fleet it is destroying cannot function without the world around it, without the flags, the horns, the shouted orders across gunwales, without the physical presence of a commander whose face men recognize. Strip that away, and you are left with thousands of vessels, crewed by soldiers who are trained to follow, drifting in the dark, with absolutely no one left to follow. Dawn is the cruelest part. When pale gray light finally separates ocean from sky over Hakata Bay, it reveals a panorama that no longer belongs exclusively to 1281. Hundreds of hulls simply gone. Hundreds more listing, burning, settling into water, cluttered with debris and bodies, until the sea itself looks wounded. 20 miles of wreckage, where an invasion fleet stood hours ago. And if you have ever seen aerial photographs of Highway 80 outside Kuwait City in 1991, you have already seen this morning. A retreating Iraqi column, tens of thousands of vehicles and soldiers, stretched bumper to bumper, along 60 miles of road, convinced that mass meant survival. The Korean warships that broke formation during the night did everything right. They identified a threat axis, organized experienced crews, and moved to envelop it. That instinct has been rewarded in naval warfare for 3,000 years. It was rewarded in 1281 too, just not for them. The thing they were hunting had already repositioned at 30 knots, moving through total darkness. Their flanking maneuver arrived at empty ocean, 90 seconds after being acquired at close range. Those ships no longer existed. In 1967, Egyptian armored columns executed textbook Soviet flanking doctrine across the Sinai with proper formations and proper spacing, driving straight into kill zones, mapped by reconnaissance they never detected. The 155mm shells, now landing among the densest surviving clusters, do not need satellite guidance against targets built from wood, rope, and human bodies. Precision is a courtesy. No one is extending. Airburst rounds detonate above crowded decks and turn rigging into shrapnel. This is not combat. It is an engineering mismatch measured in lives. And that phrase describes more military catastrophes across the last 8 centuries than any strategic doctrine ever published. Every generation produces leaders who believe their numbers and their courage will be enough. Every generation watches those leaders sail straight into a version of this same dawn. So what is it exactly that we keep refusing to learn? And which side of that lesson do you think we are on right now? Somewhere between Korea and the Japanese coast, a handful of oarsmen are pulling hard against the current, and they are the only verdict that matters. Not the fireballs, not the shattered timber, still spinning in the wake of something they will never have language for. The verdict is a few dozen men in leaking boats, carrying a story that sounds like madness, rowing toward a court that will not believe a word of it. That is what 700 years of technological supremacy actually purchases you. Not annihilation, not silence, just a rumor you cannot kill. Stand here in the present and look at what just happened with honest eyes. 80 vertical launch cells, the entire offensive magazine of the most expensive surface combatant the United States Navy has ever floated. 80 shots against 4,400 targets. The math doesn't care how advanced your fire control is. It doesn't care that your radar cross-section matches a fishing trawler, or that your hull was shaped by engineers who understood stealth geometry better than any shipwright in Kublai Khan's dockyards understood wood. 80 is 80. You can be surgical, you can collapse command structures, and then rake those clusters with gun systems designed for close-range butchery. And it works. The invasion dies, but the edges survive. The ships farthest from the kill zone, positioned on the periphery, the ones whose captains had the good instinct, or the bad luck, they run, and running is enough. Here is the judgment. Our century owes this scenario, and it is not comfortable. We built a destroyer, so far beyond anything the 13th century could imagine, that it might as well be divine intervention. And it still cannot eliminate every trace of what it fought. The Mongol military machine was the most disciplined fighting force of its age. And that discipline, the tight formations, the coordinated maneuvering, the instinct to cluster and present a unified front, fed directly into the targeting logic of systems designed to prefer dense groupings. Every correct decision those sailors made accelerated their own destruction. They weren't wrong, just operating inside rules that no longer applied. And if that doesn't sound familiar to anyone watching a modern carrier group sail through waters, increasingly crowded with autonomous drones and hypersonic missiles, then you haven't been paying attention to the part of this story, the part that is actually about you. February 1294, Kublai Khan is lying on silk cushions in his palace. 79 years old, his liver failing, his physicians whispering behind screens. On the table beside him, still weighted down with jade paperweights, sit the draft orders for a third invasion of Japan. He never stopped writing them. The man who watched 4,400 ships turned to kindling off Hakata Bay, looked at the survivor reports, looked at the descriptions of a black vessel that moved without oars and killed without closing distance. And his only conclusion was that he needed more ships next time. Not different tactics, not a new strategy, just more. That reflex is the real story here. Not the Zumwalt, not the missiles or the radar-absorbing hull, or the 700 years of engineering separating a stealth destroyer from a Song dynasty war junk. The real story is that the most decisive tactical victory imaginable produced exactly zero strategic change in the mind of the man who lost. And the Zumwalt, for all its quiet lethality, understood this problem not at all. It could turn a wooden fleet into driftwood before sunrise. It could not make an emperor reconsider his ambitions. It could not garrison a coastline, or feed a population, or prevent the next generation of Mongol shipwrights from felling trees. The smoke clears over Hakata Bay. The wreckage drifts south, and somewhere in a palace, on the other side of the continent, a dying conqueror is already convinced that the right fleet and the right moment are just one more campaign away. The Yuan dynasty outlasted him by 74 years before it collapsed, under rebellion and the accumulated weight of trying to hold everything at once. Japan was never invaded again. Japanese monks spent the next 7 centuries arguing over what saved them, and not one of them arrived at an answer that satisfied the next generation. Here is what should keep you uncomfortable. We build ships now that Kublai Khan couldn't have imagined in a fever dream. We orbit satellites that watch every ocean in real time. We engineer weapons that strike from beyond the horizon with surgical precision. So, if you could send any weapon from any century back to any war, would it actually change what happens after the shooting stops? Or would it just make the wreckage more expensive? Drop your answer below.